In the early days of racing, the first car across the finish line was frequently a Fiat.
Back in 1972, Italian automobile designer Bertone collaborated with Fiat to produce the X1, a tiny mid-engine two-seater that replaced the Fiat 850 Spider. With a monocoque chassis built and designed by Bertone and final assembly by Fiat, it was the first Fiat to have U.S. safety regulations considered during its design, and nearly two-thirds of all X19s were sold in North America. By 1982, with sales plummeting, Fiat left the North American market. However, Bertone offered to take over all production and sales of the X19 until its last year of 1989. Even after 160,000 were built, they are nearly all gone today. This is the story of the Fiat and Bertone X19. This is my old car.
Riempitelo a due con la Fiat X1, lo Spider dal motore centrale. Fiat X1 5-speed.
If you were a car-loving kid in the 80s like I was, you knew one of the hottest new cars back then, at least when it was released in 1983 as an 84 model, was the Pontiac Fiero. The X19 wasn't worth nearly as much as it was in the 70s. A clear example of this was this episode of the TV show The Fall Guy.
Don't worry, your insurance will cover it.
Not mine, yours.
With a car chase scene that involves a Fiero, which I included a clip from for my Fiero episode. The Fiero was worth a lot more than an X19 back then, and they couldn't afford to wreck the Fiero. So what did they do instead? Just watch. Does that look like a Fiero to you? Nope, they smashed up an X19 instead. And of course, it had to explode too. The history of the X19 begins with its predecessor, the Fiat 850 Spider. Fiat's 850 line also included a more humble-looking little coupe, but the Spider was a convertible, designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro, who later also designed the original Volkswagen Golf and the DeLorean.
Great Scott!
Giugiaro worked for Italian coachbuilder Bertone back then, and although the Spider was a classic look for the 1960s, Bertone wanted to move in a different direction for the 850's eventual successor, which led to the Auto Bianche A112 runabout in 1969, designed by Bertone's chief designer, Marcello Gandini. The runabout's distinctive wedge shape looked more like a powerboat on wheels, and was a radical departure from the 850 Spider. Like most any other concept, it included features that would never make it to production, such as a short windscreen and headlamps attached to the C-pillars. But its mid-engine design would definitely carry forward to the X19. The runabout's wedge shape would become a trademark styling element for Gandini, who was arguably much more famous for his designs he provided for Lamborghini, the Miura in 1966, and the car which made the wedge shape most famous, the Countach in 1974. The X19 came out 2 years earlier than the Countach, making the X1's wedge shape seem tame in comparison. Speaking of X19, let's talk about that name. Known in Italy as X19, the name was a departure from Fiat's typical nomenclature of the time. Prior Fiats would typically maintain the same name in production that they had as a project code during development. The downside of this was the name was easily leaked to the public long before it was production ready, so Fiat later changed their project coding to start with X1, the 1 referring to passenger cars, followed by a second number that was simply sequential in their project list, making it more difficult to determine which final name it would be. The first was the X11, that later became the Fiat 128 in 1969, and the Auto Bianche A112 was Project X12. Once they reached project number 9, it was the only car whose project code name was retained for production, unlike any successors, which lasted until 1978 with the X138. Fiat subsidiary Lancia also used the same coding scheme, as their Lancia Monte Carlo was originally the X120, and is sometimes referred to as a sister car to the X19, as the Monte Carlo shared the same McPherson strut design as the X19. If you lived in the US back then, you knew it as a Lancia Scorpion, as Lancia could not use the name Monte Carlo, since Chevrolet already held rights to that name. The X19 used the same engine as the runabout concept, which was Fiat's new 128 inline 4-cylinder. Like the runabout, the X19 would position the 1.3-liter engine to be transverse instead of the more typical longitudinal, and move it behind the driver to become Fiat's first production mid-engine car. The fuel tank and spare tire were wedged between the seats and the engine, and a small trunk was fitted behind the engine. Integrated into the side creases were scoops to help direct air into the radiator, and the front hood was much shorter than the runabout, but still offered a front trunk that could hold the removable Targa top. The X19 had the North American market in mind during its design, so it was ready to conform to the necessary requirements to make it legal for importing here, at least those known upon its release in Europe in 1972. However, it just missed one of the most important requirements that arrived after it was too late to plan for it. and that was the bumpers. In its first year being sold in the US in 1974, the bumper design was simple, with small extensions that better fit the character of the car. But in 1975, with 5-mile-an-hour bumper requirements, the car's look changed dramatically, looking more like a ladder frame attached to the front and rear. To say it looked bad was a serious understatement. Things weren't any better on the inside, with strict emission standards that made the already weak engine even worse, resulting in 0 to 60 times that could reach as much as 15 seconds, and only having a chance to exceed 100 miles per hour if going downhill. But for a mid-engine Italian sports car, they still cost around $4,100 in the US in 1974, far less than the 30 to 40 grand required to get another Italian mid-engine sports car available back then, the Ferrari 308 GTB. True, the Ferrari had about 3 times the horsepower, but the Fiat's agility, standard 4-speed manual, small size, and low weight helped negate the horsepower difference a little bit, with some referring to the X1 as a baby Ferrari.
For a baby Ferrari, 2,200...
Did you just call it a baby Ferrari?
He did. Because it is mid-engined Italian. It's exactly what it is.
Its first year in the US, 1974, resulted in over 20,000 sold. The agility in particular made the X1 a potential starting point for a new race car for Fiat's racing subsidiary, Abarth. In 1973, the Abarth X1 Prototipo was developed to replace the 124 Spider Abarth as Fiat's main rally car. Its engine was upgraded to 1.8 liters and 16 valves and twin carburetors, fed by an F1-style air intake above the roof. Sadly, the Prototipo never went beyond the prototype stage, and Abarth would later cancel the project and move their rally plans to the Fiat 131. Only minor changes were done to the X1 between 1976 and 78. However, pricing in the US had increased to $5,700. Despite the price increases, the Fiats were still plagued by durability and reliability issues. Hence, the commonly believed meaning of the letters FIAT stood for
Fix It Again, Tony.
And this reputation resulted in sales drops over those years. Upgrades finally arrived in 1979, with a front bumper design looking a bit more integrated into the car's design than before, as well as a new dashboard and new seats. The engine was upgraded to 1.5 liters with a Bosch electronic ignition and 5-speed transaxle. Despite a price bump to over $7,300, these improvements helped return sales to be closer to 1974 levels. Due to California's stricter emission requirements, the X1 was upgraded to electronic fuel injection in 1980, and the same option was pushed to the rest of the US the following year. This helped push the horsepower rating back to the 75 number it was intended to have before all the smog controls had decreased horsepower in the previous years.
Clarkson!
However, Fiat's overall sales in the US were dwindling,
Where's my roof?
and the cost of imports was making it a losing proposition to continue here.
What's that?
With a majority of X1 being sold in the US, it also meant Fiat would stop that model's production.
Why have you driven over your own roof?
But considering the X1 was still a joint effort between Fiat and Bertone, it was given a second chance to survive.
I'm in a small, stylish Italian sports car. Supposed to be looking good. I look like a frostbitten gnome.
Starting in 1982, if you wanted to buy an X1 it was no longer branded as a Fiat, but instead as a Bertone.
Great Scott.
Bertone went from just providing the body to also taking over the assembly process that Fiat once provided, although Fiat still built the engines and transmissions. But Fiat had closed up their US dealerships and no longer offered a way to import the cars to the US. Enter Malcom Bricklin, the same Malcom Bricklin who tried, and failed, to sell his gull-wing sports car, the SV1, in 1974. In 1982, Bricklin was the head of International Automobile Importers Incorporated, or IAI, which managed the sales and imports of the X1 at Bertone dealerships. Although Malcom Bricklin's most famous endeavor is arguably importing the Yugo to the US from 1985 to 92, another story worth telling for a future My Old Car episode.
Introducing the new 87 Yugo GV.
Bricklin helped keep the Bertone X1 alive in the US, but the formerly cheap car was now not so cheap, doubling in price from its debut 10 years earlier. Sales kept dropping, so much so that once the Pontiac Fiero and Toyota MR2 debuted in 1984, Bricklin saw the writing on the wall and ended his partnership by 1985. But Bertone didn't give up and continued the imports of the X1 via MIK Automotive, based in North Hollywood, California. Now no longer the only affordable mid-engine sports car for sale in the US, and still sporting its original wedge shape, which by this point was looking far more dated. Sales of the X1 dropped to only 1,400 in 1986, and less than 400 were sold in 1988. Although 1989 was the official last model year, remaining unsold models were available for sale for the next few years, with some dealers trying to capitalize on the potential rarity of new models by jacking up the prices to as high as $20,000 or more. a lot to spend on a car in the early 90s. Most, however, sold for far less than that. Today, it's estimated that less than 1,000 X19s may still exist in the US. The primary cause of the severe drop in availability goes back to the car's durability problems, coupled with serious propensity to rust away. Only recently have sales of any remaining well-preserved models had their sales prices increase, simply because of the car's rarity. Ironically, this rarity could make the remaining X19s more valuable than the remaining Fieros and MR2s. Pontiac sold about twice as many Fieros, and although Toyota sold about the same number of MR2s as the X19, Toyota's penchant for high quality means there's probably more MR2s out there too. After they left in 1982, Fiat would remain out of the North American market until 2011, after their merger with Chrysler to become Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, or FCA. Their first model upon their return, the revamped 500, came at a time when car sales were steadily trending away from small cars to trucks and SUVs. Although Fiat did attempt to return to the sports car market with a new version of the 124 Spider in 2016. Underneath the new bodywork, it was a Mazda MX-5 Miata. Although Mazda's reputation for quality was higher than Fiat, the Fiat badge was a turnoff for many buyers, as their old reliability issues hadn't improved much with modern Fiats. Although the MX-5 remains in production as of 2023, the 124 Spider was gone by 2020. As of the making of this video in July of 2023, the only remaining model for Fiat sold in the US is the 500X, which itself is a shared platform with the Jeep Renegade. Far fewer 500Xs are sold than Renegades, so I expect it is only a matter of time before Fiat leaves the US market yet again.
I know. I was driving while hot.
Until then, we have our memories of Fiat's most daring sports car design of its time, the X19. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you once owned a car from the 80s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.
Take it easy, Cole.